The video camera trembled in Bobby Whitmore's weathered hands as he filmed the impossible sight on his chest. 30 pounds of wild bobcat, muscles that could snap a deer's neck, now purring like a diesel engine against his Vietnam veteran's heart. Spirit's spotted fur rose and fell with each breath. Those deadly amber eyes closed in complete trust. But something was wrong. The big cat whimpered in his sleep, massive paws twitching against old wounds only Bobby could see. Scars crisscrossed Spirit's paw pads, signs of a past that haunted them both in the dark hours. The phone rang, shrill and demanding. Bobby's dog tags caught the afternoon light as he reached around his sleeping companion. The caller ID made his blood run cold. Montana Wildlife Services, Legal Division. "As my granddaddy used to say," Bobby whispered to the camera, never stopping his gentle stroking. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. Just never thought one of those ways would have retractable claws." Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 4 years ago, 8-year-old Tommy Mitchell's sneakers crunched through autumn leaves as he took his usual shortcut home from school. The Montana back road stretched empty in both directions, nothing but pine trees and the occasional deer crossing. That's when he saw her. The mother bobcat lying twisted in the ditch, her tawny fur matted with blood where the pickup truck had clipped her. Tommy's breath caught in his throat. Mama always said to stay away from wild animals, but something made him scramble down the embankment. The big cat's amber eyes stared at nothing, already clouded over. That's when he heard it. A tiny mewing sound, desperate and afraid. Hidden beneath his mother's still warm body, a kitten no bigger than Tommy's fist fought for each breath. The little bobcat's eyes weren't even open yet, his spotted fur barely visible beneath the blood and birth fluid. Tommy's small hands shook as he gently lifted the orphan, feeling the rapid heartbeat against his palm. "Hey there, little guy," Tommy whispered, tucking the kitten inside his jacket. "I got you now." The walk home felt like forever. Tommy's mind raced with possibilities. Dad would call animal control. Mom would worry about diseases. They'd take the kitten away to some cold government facility where nobody would love him proper. Tommy had seen enough nature documentaries to know what happened to orphaned wildlife. Most didn't make it. The Mitchell family garage smelled of motor oil and sawdust, Dad's weekend workshop cluttered with tools and half-finished projects. Tommy cleared out an old cardboard box, layering it with his winter jacket. The kitten mewed weakly, mouth opening and closing like a baby bird. "I'll call you Spirit," Tommy decided, watching the tiny creature fight to live. "'Cause you're fighting like a ghost to stay alive." That first night, Tommy snuck out every 2 hours with a doll's bottle filled with warm milk. Spirit's needle-sharp claws gripped Tommy's thumb with surprising strength for something so small. By morning, the kitten was actually purring, a sound like distant thunder. For 6 months, Tommy built an elaborate system of care. Breakfast meant sneaking bacon to the garage, lunchtime visits during recess when he could run home, evening homework sessions that were really feeding and playtime. Spirit grew from a helpless kitten into a sleek young bobcat, his amber eyes bright with intelligence and trust. "Finders keepers, losers weepers," Tommy would tell Spirit during their secret conversations, "and I found you fair and square." Around Spirit's neck, Tommy discovered something strange, a faded collar from his mother, with markings that looked almost like military tags. But Tommy was just a kid. He couldn't read the significance of those weathered symbols, couldn't know they connected to a story that began decades before he was born, in a jungle halfway around the world. 6 months ago, the sound of clanging metal echoed through the Mitchell family garage as Dad searched for his socket wrench set. Tommy, now 12 and lankier than his 8-year-old self, was at school when disaster struck. 4 years of carefully hidden secret was about to explode into the open like a hand grenade in a church social. "What in the Sam Hill?" Dad's voice cut off mid-sentence as he rounded the workbench and came face to face with 60 pounds of fully grown bobcat. Spirit, now magnificent in his prime with tufted ears and powerful haunches, had been napping in his favorite corner behind the tool cabinet. The sudden intrusion startled him awake, and he rose to his full height, amber eyes meeting human eyes in a moment of mutual shock. Dad stumbled backward, knocking over a paint can. "Jesus Christ Almighty!" The commotion brought Mom running from the kitchen, dish towel still in her hands. Her scream could have woken the dead when she saw Spirit standing there, wild and beautiful and completely impossible in their suburban garage. "Get back!" Dad shouted, grabbing a rake handle. "Linda, call 911!" But Spirit didn't attack. Instead, he did something that confused them both. He looked around frantically, calling out with that distinctive bobcat chirp. He was looking for Tommy, his person, his protector. The sound was heartbreaking, like a child crying for his mama. When Tommy burst through the garage door 20 minutes later, still wearing his backpack from the school bus, he found his parents pressed against the far wall while Animal Control Officer Martinez suited up in protective gear. "No!" Tommy screamed, dropping his books and rushing toward Spirit. "Don't hurt him!" "Tommy, get away from that thing!" Mom's voice cracked with terror. But Spirit's whole demeanor changed the instant he saw Tommy. The wild predator became a house cat, pressing against the boy's legs and purring loud enough to rattle the windows. Tommy's arms went around Spirit's neck, and for a moment the garage fell silent except for that rumbling contentment. "He's my best friend," Tommy said, tears streaming down his face. "He would never hurt me. Never." Dad's face went through about 6 different shades of red. "Tommy Mitchell, you've been hiding a wild animal in our garage. Do you have any idea how dangerous—" "He's not dangerous!" Tommy's voice cracked with adolescent fury. "He's Spirit. I saved him when he was just a baby. His mama got hit by a truck and he would have died if I didn't." "That's a bobcat, son." Officer Martinez's voice was patient but firm. 60 pounds of apex predator. It doesn't matter how you raised it. Wild animals aren't pets. Mom found her voice, shaky but determined. "How long has this been going on?" 4 years, Tommy whispered, not meeting their eyes. The admission hit like a physical blow. 4 years of deception. 4 years of their 12-year-old son living with a predator. 4 years of what could have been tragedy. "My God, Tommy." Mom's hand went to her throat. "It could have killed you in your sleep. It could have—" "He sleeps next to me," Tommy shot back. "He brings me his toys when I'm sad. He knows when I'm sick and won't leave my side. He's not an it. He's family." The word family hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Officer Martinez cleared his throat, all business now. "Folks, I need to remove this animal immediately. Keeping wildlife without proper permits is a federal offense. You're looking at serious fines, possible jail time." Spirit seemed to sense the danger. He pressed closer to Tommy, those intelligent amber eyes darting between the adults, his ears flattened against his skull, not in aggression, but in fear. "Please," Tommy begged, falling to his knees beside Spirit. "Please don't take him away. He doesn't know how to be wild. I raised him from a baby. He thinks he's my brother." Dad's anger cracked, revealing something softer underneath. "Son, we can't. This isn't legal. This isn't safe." "Safe?" Tommy's voice rose to a breaking pitch. "Safe for who? He's never hurt anybody. The only time he's ever showed his claws was when that stray dog tried to get in here last winter, and that was to protect me." Officer Martinez was already preparing the catch pole, a long-handled noose designed for dangerous animals. Spirit saw it and pressed himself against the garage wall, trapped between strangers and the boy he loved. "Tommy, you need to step away," the officer said gently. "I know this is hard, but—" "No." Tommy spread his arms wide, shielding Spirit. "You can't have him." What happened next would haunt the family for months. Officer Martinez approached with the catch-pole, and Spirit, confused and terrified, did what any cornered animal would do. He growled, not at Tommy, never at Tommy, but at the approaching threat. The sound was like nothing they'd ever heard. 60 pounds of predator expressing pure fear and confusion. Dad grabbed Tommy's arm, trying to pull him away, and that's when Tommy lost it completely. "Don't touch me!" He shook off his father's grip. "This is all your fault. You never listen. You never understand anything." The standoff stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Spirit, sensing Tommy's distress, began that chirping call again, the sound that meant, "Where are you?" in Bobcat language. Finally, Officer Martinez managed to slip the noose around Spirit's neck. The big cat didn't fight, didn't struggle. He just looked at Tommy with those amber eyes that seemed to ask, why? "I'm sorry," Tommy sobbed as they led Spirit toward the transport cage. "I'm so sorry, boy. I love you. I'll find you. I promise I'll find you." Spirit's cries from inside the cage tore through the afternoon air like physical wounds. Tommy tried to follow the truck down the driveway, but Dad held him back. That night, the Mitchell house was quieter than a tomb. Tommy locked himself in his room and wouldn't come down for dinner. Mom and Dad sat at the kitchen table, not speaking, both lost in their own guilt and confusion. "We did the right thing," Dad said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Did we?" Mom's dish towel was twisted into knots. "Did you see how that animal looked at him? That wasn't a wild beast. That was love." 3 days later, they got the call from Pine Valley Wildlife Center. Spirit wasn't eating, wasn't responding to any stimulus. The veterinarian used words like failure to thrive and psychological trauma. "Animals that have been improperly socialized, doctor." Thompson explained over the phone, "often can't adapt to either captivity or release. We'll do what we can, but—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Tommy heard it anyway from his spot on the stairs where he'd been eavesdropping. That's when the real guilt set in. Not just for Tommy, but for his parents, too. They'd thought they were protecting their son, but maybe they'd just sentenced his best friend to death. 3 months ago, Dr. Catherine Thompson stood in the sterile hallway of Pine Valley Wildlife Center, holding a clipboard that felt heavier than lead in her hands. Case number 2847 stared back at her from the medical chart. Not a name, just a number. A 60-pound male bobcat who'd been living illegally with a human family for 4 years, now scheduled for humane euthanasia on Friday at 2:00 p.m. Kate had been the center's head veterinarian for 8 years, but certain decisions never got easier. She'd seen plenty of animals cross the line from wild to domestic, and most never found their way back. The bureaucracy was clear. Animals that couldn't be rehabilitated for release and weren't suitable for educational programs had one fate left. But something about this case gnawed at her like a splinter under the skin. She'd watched the security footage of Spirit's arrival 3 months ago, the way he'd pressed himself against the transport cage bars, calling out in that distinctive bobcat chirp. Not aggressive calls, not territorial. They were the sounds of abandonment, of a creature crying out for someone who wasn't coming. Kate pushed through the double doors into the housing area. Her footsteps, echoing off concrete walls, painted that institutional shade of green that was supposed to be calming but just looked like old hospitals. The sound made Spirit's ears twitch, but he didn't lift his head from where he lay curled in the far corner of his enclosure. "Hey there, big guy," Kate said softly, approaching the chain-link gate. Spirit's amber eyes tracked her movement, but there was no light in them, no curiosity, no hope. In 3 months, Kate had watched this magnificent animal transform from a confused but healthy specimen into something that barely resembled the apex predator he was born to be. His ribs showed through fur that had lost its luster. His powerful haunches, built for 20-foot leaps through mountain terrain, were wasted from lack of use. The behavioral assessment reports made for grim reading. Spirit showed no hunting instincts when presented with live prey. He demonstrated no fear response to human presence. In fact, he seemed to crave human contact, which was the opposite of what they needed for release. Most damning of all, he'd stopped eating regularly unless staff members sat nearby, mimicking the meal pattern he'd learned with his human family. Kate opened the enclosure gate and stepped inside, something she normally wouldn't do with a bobcat. But Spirit barely acknowledged her presence. She'd done this before, sat with dying animals in their final days, offering whatever comfort she could. It was the part of her job that broke her heart regularly, but someone had to bear witness. "You're grieving, aren't you?" she whispered, settling cross-legged on the concrete floor about 6 feet from where Spirit lay. "You don't understand why your boy isn't coming back." The words hit her harder than expected. Kate's own childhood had been marked by loss, her parents' divorce when she was 12, followed by her beloved dog Rex dying of cancer the same year. She'd learned early that love and loss were two sides of the same coin, but somehow that knowledge never made it easier. Spirit's breathing was shallow, his body conserving energy like an animal preparing to die. Kate had seen it before in wolves, in bears, in countless creatures who'd lost their will to live. The technical term was failure to thrive, but Kate knew it by its real name: a broken heart. Her mind drifted to the phone calls she'd received from the boy's parents over the past month. The mother, Linda Mitchell, called weekly asking about Spirit's condition. Her voice always carried that particular strain of guilt that Kate recognized from families who'd had to surrender beloved pets. "He asks about the cat every day," Mrs. Mitchell had said during the last call. "Tommy's not eating right either. He's lost 15 pounds. I'm starting to think we made a terrible mistake." But what could Kate tell her? That love wasn't enough, that good intentions couldn't override wildlife law, that sometimes the right choice and the humane choice were two different things entirely. The afternoon light streaming through the high windows caught Spirit's collar, the one detail that had puzzled Kate from the beginning. It wasn't a pet store collar. The leather was old, military grade, with markings that looked almost like service tags. When she'd asked Tommy's parents about it, they'd said Spirit's mother was wearing it when Tommy found her. Where had a wild bobcat gotten military-issued leather? Kate pulled out her phone and scrolled through the photos she'd taken of the collar markings. There were numbers, partially worn away, and what looked like unit insignia. Her grandfather had served in Vietnam, and something about these markings felt familiar. Military personnel often adopted local animals as mascots. Maybe this collar told a story that went back further than anyone realized. "You know something, don't you, boy?" Kate said, studying Spirit's still form. "There's more to your story than just a kid who loved an animal too much." Spirit's ear twitched at the sound of her voice, the first response she'd gotten from him in weeks. Kate felt a flutter of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months. Hope. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "Daniel Running Bear from Sierra Wildlife called again. Still interested in the Bobcat case. Says he might have a placement option." Kate stared at the message. Daniel's sanctuary in Wyoming was known for taking impossible cases, animals too damaged for release but too special to euthanize. If anyone could find a solution for Spirit, it would be Daniel. But was it fair to prolong the animal's suffering just because humans couldn't accept the inevitable? She looked at Spirit again, really looked at him. Beneath the depression and weight loss, she could see the magnificent creature he'd been. The intelligent eyes that had bonded with a human child. The powerful body that had trusted enough to sleep next to a 12-year-old boy for 4 years without ever causing harm. "Dad always said sometimes the right thing and the easy thing are two different things," Kate murmured, remembering her father's voice from years of difficult veterinary decisions. Spirit's breathing pattern changed slightly, still shallow, but somehow more alert. Kate had the strangest feeling he was listening, understanding more than seemed possible for an animal in his condition. The euthanasia order was scheduled for Friday. Today was Wednesday. Kate had less than 48 hours to decide whether to make that call to Daniel Running Bear or to follow protocol and end Spirit's suffering. But as she sat there in the dying afternoon light, watching this broken animal who'd loved a human child with such devotion that losing him had nearly killed them both, Kate realized the decision had already been made. Some stories were too important to end with a needle and a signature on a form. Her hands were steady as she dialed Daniel's number. Whatever came next, at least it wouldn't be giving up. And sometimes, in a world full of impossible choices, not giving up was the only victory that mattered. Spirit's eyes opened fully for the first time in weeks, those amber depths focusing on Kate's face as if he somehow understood that something had changed. Hope was a dangerous thing in wildlife rehabilitation, but as Kate watched a spark of life flicker back into this remarkable animal's eyes, she decided that some risks were worth taking. 53 years ago, 19-year-old Bobby Whitmore crouched in the suffocating humidity of a Vietnamese jungle, his M16 rifle slick with sweat and fear. The date was burned into his memory. September 15, 1969. Charlie Company, 1st Infantry Division, 3 clicks outside Tay Ninh Base Camp. What happened that day would haunt Bobby's dreams for decades, until a broken Bobcat helped him understand that some wounds could only heal when shared with another survivor. The patrol had been routine. Sweep the perimeter, check for enemy movement, return before nightfall. Bobby was point man, 19 years old and convinced he was invincible. That's when he heard the sounds coming from a bombed-out hooch hidden beneath fallen palm fronds, the distinctive yowling of something wild and hurt. "Hold up," Bobby whispered into his radio, raising his fist to signal the squad to stop. "Got something here." What he found nearly broke his teenage heart. A female bobcat, probably brought to Vietnam by some long-departed American unit as a mascot, lay trapped beneath a collapsed beam. Her left hind leg was mangled, blood seeping through tawny fur. But it wasn't her injuries that stopped Bobby cold. It was the 2 tiny cubs pressed against her belly, mewing frantically as their mother struggled to breathe. "Jesus," muttered Doc Patterson, the company medic, when Bobby called him over. "How the hell did a bobcat get in the middle of a Vietnamese jungle?" "Same way we did," Bobby said quietly. "Wrong place, wrong time." The patrol rules were clear. No delays, no distractions, no unauthorized contact with local wildlife. But something in the mother cat's amber eyes reminded Bobby of his own mother's expression when he'd left for basic training, fierce protectiveness mixed with desperate love. "Doc, can you help her?" Patterson looked around nervously. They were in Indian country, vulnerable and exposed. "Bobby, we got orders. I ain't leaving her like this." Bobby's voice carried the quiet determination that would later help him survive 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. "Look at those babies, Doc. They're gonna die without her." Against regulations and common sense, Doc Patterson spent 20 minutes splinting the bobcat's leg while Bobby stood guard. The mother cat never tried to bite, never struggled. She seemed to understand they were trying to help, those intelligent eyes watching every movement with careful attention. They carried her back to base camp in Bobby's poncho, the cubs riding in his helmet. The company commander wasn't pleased, but Vietnam had its own rules about morale and survival. If having a unit mascot helped his boys stay sane, he could overlook the paperwork. They named her Liberty, and she became the heart of Charlie Company. Liberty lived in a secure area behind the communications bunker, her cubs growing fat and playful under the protection of 60 homesick American soldiers. She wore a collar made from military webbing, marked with Bobby's dog tags and unit patch. For 6 months, Liberty and her cubs brought something resembling normalcy to their corner of hell. The cats would greet returning patrols with chirping calls, and Liberty seemed to have an uncanny ability to sense when Bobby was headed out on dangerous missions. She'd wind around his legs, purring that diesel engine rumble, as if trying to keep him safe through sheer feline determination. The end came on a clear morning in March 1970. Bobby was on watch in Tower 3 when the sniper's bullet whistled past his ear, missing him by inches before embedding in the sandbags. He dove for cover, scanning the tree line for muzzle flash, when he heard the distinctive crack of another rifle. Liberty had been sunning herself on the bunker roof, a daily ritual that brought her joy, even in that godforsaken place. The sniper's second shot, meant for Bobby's head, caught her center mass instead. She'd been moving across the roof, putting herself between Bobby and the shooter's position, when the bullet found her. Bobby emptied his magazine into the trees where the shot had come from, rage and grief making his hands shake. Other soldiers joined the firefight, and they eventually found the sniper's body 50 meters out. But Liberty was already gone, her amber eyes clouding over as she lay in the dust where Bobby cradled her. "She saved your life, son," Doc Patterson said later, as they wrapped Liberty's body in Bobby's poncho. That cat knew exactly what she was doing. The cubs, now old enough to fend for themselves, disappeared into the jungle that night. Bobby never saw them again, though he sometimes heard Bobcat calls in the distance during his remaining months in country. He shipped Liberty's collar home to Montana, along with a letter to his parents that he never sent, explaining how a wild animal had taught him more about loyalty than most humans ever would. For 53 years, Bobby carried that collar in his dresser drawer, along with his bronze star and purple hearts. He'd pull it out sometimes when the nightmares got bad, running his thumb over the worn leather and military markings. Mary Beth knew about the collar but never pressed for details. Some wounds were too deep for words. Now, sitting in Daniel Running Bear's office at Sierra Wildlife Sanctuary, Bobby stared at another collar, this one around the neck of a broken bobcat named Spirit. The markings were different, faded by time and weather, but the leather was unmistakably military grade. The unit numbers, partially visible beneath years of wear, included digits that made Bobby's hands shake. "Where did you say this animal came from?" Bobby asked, his voice rough with decades of unspoken grief. "Kid found him as a baby, next to his dead mother on a Montana back road," Daniel explained. "The mother was wearing this collar when they found her. No idea how she got it." Bobby's mind raced through possibilities that seemed impossible but felt true in his gut. Liberty's cubs had survived in that Vietnamese jungle. Maybe one had been captured, shipped to a zoo, eventually bred with native bobcats. Maybe that collar had passed from mother to daughter across generations, carrying Liberty's bloodline from a jungle battlefield to a Montana roadside. "I'll take him," Bobby said suddenly, surprising himself and everyone else in the room. Mary Beth squeezed his hand. "Bobby, we've never talked about—" "I know." Bobby's eyes never left Spirit, who was lying listlessly in his transport cage. "But look at him, Mary Beth. Really look at him." Spirit's breathing was shallow, his magnificent body reduced to skin and bones. But when Bobby approached the cage, something remarkable happened. The bobcat's ears perked up, and for the first time in months, Spirit lifted his head. Those amber eyes, so much like Liberty's, focused on Bobby's face with sudden intensity. "Hey there, soldier," Bobby whispered, extending his fingers toward the cage. "I know what it's like to lose your family. I know what it's like to survive when you don't want to." Spirit moved slowly, painfully, across the cage floor. When his wet nose touched Bobby's fingertips through the wire, both man and animal seemed to exhale decades of held breath. The connection was instant, electric, like recognition passing between kindred spirits. "He knows you," Daniel said softly, wonder in his voice. "In 8 months of rehab, he's never responded to anyone like that." Bobby understood then why Daniel had called them. This wasn't coincidence. This was Liberty keeping a promise she'd made 53 years ago in a Vietnamese jungle. She'd saved Bobby's life once with her own. Now her descendant needed saving, and Bobby finally had the chance to return the favor. "Come on home, boy," Bobby murmured, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Let's see if two old soldiers can figure out how to heal together." 2 months ago, the Whitmore Ranch stretched across 25 acres of Montana wilderness, where autumn painted the aspens gold against an impossibly blue sky. Bobby stood on his front porch, watching Daniel Running Bear's sanctuary van navigate the gravel drive, carrying what might be his last chance at redemption. Inside that vehicle was Spirit, broken, traumatized, and weighing barely 40 pounds instead of the healthy 60 he should have carried. Mary Beth joined him, her weathered hands smoothing her apron with nervous energy. At 68, she'd nursed countless children through scraped knees and broken hearts during her 30 years as a school nurse, but this felt different, more dangerous, more important. "You sure about this, Bobby?" Her voice carried the weight of 45 years of marriage, of watching her husband wake screaming from Vietnam nightmares, of loving a man who'd carried guilt like shrapnel in his chest for decades. Bobby's hand found the dog tags hanging beneath his flannel shirt, his own tags, worn smooth by half a century of nervous fingering. "Sure as I've ever been about anything, Mary Beth. That cat needs us, and maybe we need him too." When Daniel opened the transport crate in their modified barn, Spirit barely resembled the magnificent predator he'd once been. His tawny coat hung loose over protruding ribs, and those amber eyes that had once blazed with intelligence now stared at nothing. He moved to the farthest corner of the large enclosure they'd prepared, pressing himself against the wooden wall like he was trying to disappear. "He hasn't eaten properly in 3 months, Daniel explained, his voice heavy with professional concern. "Won't engage with humans, won't play, won't hunt. We've tried everything." Bobby approached the enclosure slowly, the way he'd learned to move around wounded things in another lifetime. Spirit's ears flattened against his skull, but he didn't retreat further. There was nowhere left to go. "Hey there, soldier," Bobby said softly, the same words he'd whispered in the sanctuary office. "Remember me?" For a moment, nothing. Then Spirit's head tilted slightly, those amber eyes focusing on Bobby's face with something that might have been recognition. Not the joyful recognition he'd once shown Tommy, but something deeper, the way one survivor recognizes another. That first night, Bobby slept in the barn. Mary Beth brought him blankets and coffee, shaking her head at her husband's stubbornness, but she understood. She'd seen Bobby like this before, during the early years of their marriage when the nightmares were worst. He'd disappear for hours, walking the ranch perimeter like he was still on patrol, still looking for threats that existed only in his memory. "You talked to him," Mary Beth observed on the third morning, finding Bobby sitting outside Spirit's enclosure with a cup of coffee and yesterday's newspaper. "Seems to help," Bobby said simply. "Animals know when you're lying. Can't bullshit a creature that's been where he's been." And Bobby did talk. Sitting in that old wooden chair he'd dragged from the house, he told Spirit stories he'd never shared with another living soul. About Liberty and her cubs in that Vietnamese jungle. About the weight of taking lives to save lives. about coming home to a country that didn't want to hear about the war and carrying that silence like a tumor for 50 years. "Thing about surviving," Bobby said on the fourth day, Spirit lying motionless but listening, "is you start thinking you don't deserve to. Start thinking maybe the ones who didn't make it were better men than you." Spirit's ear twitched, the first voluntary movement Bobby had seen. "But that's survivor's guilt talking, and survivor's guilt is just another kind of enemy fire. You can't let it pin you down forever." By the end of the first week, Spirit was taking food when Bobby sat nearby. Not much, just enough to keep living, but it was progress. Bobby would sit there for hours, reading aloud from Western novels and farm reports, his gravelly voice the only sound in the peaceful barn. Mary Beth worried about Bobby's obsession, but she also saw changes in her husband that amazed her. The constant tension in his shoulders was easing. The nighttime pacing had stopped. For the first time in decades, Bobby seemed to have found a purpose that didn't involve reliving old battles. "That cat's helping you as much as you're helping him," she said one evening, watching Bobby brush Spirit's coat through the enclosure fence. Spirit hadn't moved away, another small miracle. "Maybe that's how healing works," Bobby replied. "Maybe you can't do it alone." The breakthrough came on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning. Bobby had been telling Spirit about his grandfather's ranch, about learning to gentle wild horses as a boy, when he noticed the bobcat had crept forward, not all the way to the fence, but closer than he'd ever been. "You know what I learned about horses?" Bobby said, keeping his voice low and steady. "They can sense fear, but they can also sense love. And love's stronger than fear, if you give it time to work." Spirit's breathing changed, becoming less shallow, more alert. Bobby slowly extended his hand toward the fence, palm up, fingers loose. For a long moment, nothing. Then Spirit stretched his neck forward, that pink nose barely touching Bobby's fingertips through the wire mesh. The contact lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it changed everything. Spirit jerked back immediately, but his eyes stayed fixed on Bobby's face with something that looked almost like hope. "There you are," Bobby whispered, tears running down his cheeks. "There's my soldier." That afternoon, Spirit ate his entire meal for the first time since arriving. By evening, he was actually grooming himself, another sign of returning mental health. Mary Beth watched from the barn doorway as Bobby sat in his chair, reading aloud while Spirit listened from his corner. "He's coming back," she said softly. "We both are," Bobby replied. Over the following weeks, the progress accelerated. Spirit began using his climbing platforms, batting at hanging toys with increasing energy. His weight started climbing back toward normal. Most importantly, he began seeking Bobby's presence instead of simply tolerating it. The night Spirit first purred was a revelation. Bobby had been sharing a memory about Liberty, how she used to sleep on his feet in the bunker, when that distinctive rumbling filled the barn. Spirit was pressed against the fence now, as close to Bobby as the barrier would allow, his whole body vibrating with contentment. "Mary Beth!" Bobby called out, his voice cracking with emotion. "Mary Beth, come hear this!" She rushed from the house to find her husband weeping openly, one hand pressed against the fence where Spirit leaned into his touch. The sound of that purr, deep and powerful and alive, filled the barn like music. "He forgives us," Bobby said wonderingly. "How can he forgive us when we couldn't protect him?" Mary Beth understood then what this was really about. Not just saving a broken animal, but Bobby finally forgiving himself for all the things he couldn't save in Vietnam. For Liberty, for the soldiers who didn't come home, for the young man he'd been before the war, changed everything. That night, for the first time in 50 years, Bobby slept without nightmares. In the barn, Spirit slept too, curled up against the fence closest to where Bobby's scent lingered. Two soldiers, finally finding peace in each other's presence. The transformation wasn't complete. Both man and Bobcat still carried scars that might never fully heal. But they'd found something worth fighting for again: each other. And sometimes, in the darkest corners of survival, that was enough to light the way home. 2 weeks ago, Bobby Whitmore was feeding Spirit his morning meal when the official Montana Fish Wildlife Park's truck pulled into their gravel driveway. The sight of that green government vehicle made Bobby's blood pressure spike in ways that reminded him of incoming artillery rounds. He'd been dreading this moment for months, ever since Spirit had started showing real progress. Officer Jennifer Hayes stepped out of the truck carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of expression that meant bad news was coming. Bobby had seen that look before, on doctors' faces when they delivered terminal diagnoses, on military officers when they brought word of fallen comrades. "Mr. Whitmore?" Officer Hayes approached the barn where Bobby stood frozen, Spirit's breakfast bowl still in his hands. "I'm here about the Bobcat you're housing illegally." The word illegally hit like a slap. Bobby had known this day would come, but hearing it spoken aloud made his chest tighten with familiar panic. Spirit, sensing the tension in Bobby's voice and posture, pressed himself against the enclosure fence with worried amber eyes. "I have a permit application pending," Bobby said carefully, his military training kicking in. "Stay calm. State facts. Don't show weakness." "Sir, that application was denied 3 weeks ago." Officer Hayes consulted her paperwork with bureaucratic efficiency. "You were supposed to receive notification by mail." Mary Beth emerged from the house, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. She'd been baking Bobby's favorite apple pie, a Tuesday tradition that had helped anchor them both through 45 years of marriage. Now that simple domestic ritual felt like something from another lifetime. "We never got any letter," Mary Beth said firmly, moving to stand beside her husband. At 68, she'd learned to fight for what mattered. "Regardless, I'm here to inform you that this animal must be removed within 48 hours. Officer Hayes's voice carried the weight of regulation and law. Montana State Code is very clear about private ownership of native wildlife. "Removed to where?" Bobby's voice was dangerously quiet, the tone Mary Beth recognized from his worst PTSD episodes. "Billings Zoo has agreed to take him temporarily, pending evaluation for placement in an appropriate facility." The words hit Bobby like shrapnel. Billings Zoo meant concrete enclosures and gawking crowds. It meant Spirit spending his remaining years as a curiosity for tourists, isolated from any meaningful human connection. It meant undoing months of painstaking rehabilitation. "Lady, you don't understand." Bobby stepped closer to the fence where Spirit waited, his powerful frame now filling out with proper nutrition and care. "This animal was dying when we got him. Refused to eat, refused to engage. He was scheduled for euthanasia. I understand your attachment, Mr. Whitmore, but the law is the law. Wild animals belong in the wild or in licensed facilities, not in private homes." "He can't be released." Bobby's voice cracked with desperation. "He was raised by humans from infancy. He has no survival skills. Releasing him would be a death sentence." Officer Hayes consulted her clipboard again, unmoved by Bobby's plea. "That's not my determination to make. I have a legal order to remove this animal. You can cooperate voluntarily, or I can return with additional personnel and tranquilizer equipment." Mary Beth watched her husband's face cycle through emotions she'd seen too many times. Helplessness, rage, the particular despair that came from being powerless against institutional authority. She'd nursed him through panic attacks triggered by exactly this kind of bureaucratic inflexibility. 48 hours, Officer Hayes repeated, heading back toward her truck. "After that, we'll consider this animal abandonment and proceed accordingly." The truck disappeared down their gravel drive, leaving behind a silence that felt like the moment after an explosion. Bobby stood motionless, staring at the fence where Spirit waited with trusting amber eyes. "Bobby?" Mary Beth's voice was careful, gentle. She'd learned to recognize the signs when her husband was sliding toward that dark place where Vietnam nightmares lived. "I can't do it again, Mary Beth." His voice was barely a whisper. "I can't watch another one die because of my failure." That evening, Bobby sat in his usual chair beside Spirit's enclosure, but he wasn't reading or talking. He just stared at the wall with thousand-yard eyes that Mary Beth hadn't seen in years. Spirit sensed the change immediately, pressing against the fence and making soft, chirping sounds. Bobcat comfort calls that had never failed to soothe Bobby before. But tonight, nothing helped. Bobby was lost in memories of Liberty's amber eyes clouding over, of soldiers who'd trusted him to bring them home and never made it out of that jungle. The weight of survivor's guilt pressed down like a physical force. "They'll put him in a cage," Bobby said when Mary Beth brought him coffee. "Strangers gawking at him through glass. He'll stop eating again. He'll die slowly. And I'll have failed him just like I failed her." Mary Beth had heard enough. At 68, she'd earned the right to speak her mind without apology. "Robert Whitmore, you listen to me. You didn't fail anybody in Vietnam, and you're not failing Spirit now. 48 hours, Mary Beth. 48 hours, and they take him. Then we fight." Her voice carried the steel backbone that had attracted Bobby 50 years ago. "We call newspapers. We call lawyers. We call every politician in Montana if we have to." Bobby shook his head with the weariness of a man who'd fought institutional battles before. "System's bigger than we are. Always has been. Maybe. But I didn't marry a quitter." Mary Beth knelt beside Bobby's chair, taking his weathered hands in her own. "That cat didn't survive everything he's been through just to give up now. And neither did you." That night, Bobby couldn't sleep. He paced the house like he was back on perimeter watch, checking windows and doors with military precision. Around 3 a.m., Mary Beth found him standing at the kitchen window, staring toward the barn where Spirit waited. "What if we just took him and ran?" Bobby's voice was hollow with desperation. "Got in the truck and headed for Canada? And lived as fugitives for the rest of our lives?" Mary Beth shook her head. "That's not living, Bobby. That's just another kind of prison." The next morning brought phone calls and frantic research. Mary Beth contacted Daniel Running Bear, who promised to make calls to other sanctuaries. She reached out to their state representative, their congressman, anyone who might have influence over wildlife regulations. But bureaucracy moved slowly, and they had less than 24 hours. Bobby spent the day sitting with Spirit, trying to explain what was happening. The Bobcat seemed to understand that something was wrong. He stayed pressed against the fence, purring constantly, as if trying to comfort the man who'd saved his life. "I'm sorry, soldier," Bobby whispered, his voice breaking. "I promised I'd protect you, and I'm failing, just like I always fail when it matters most." That afternoon, Dr. Thompson called with news that felt like a gut punch. Spirit's behavioral assessments from his time at the Wildlife Center had been reviewed by a state board. The official determination: unsuitable for release, unsuitable for breeding programs, unsuitable for educational purposes due to over-socialization with humans. In bureaucratic language, it was a death sentence with extra steps. "There is one possibility," Dr. Thompson said carefully. "If you could prove educational value, demonstrate proper facilities, and find a licensed facility willing to partner with you." How long would that take? Months, maybe years. Time they didn't have. That evening, as the deadline approached, Bobby made a decision that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He called the local newspaper, then the TV station. If the system was going to destroy Spirit, it would do so in the full light of public scrutiny. "This is about more than one Bobcat," he told the reporter who arrived that evening. "This is about whether bureaucracy or compassion wins when a life hangs in the balance." As the camera rolled, Bobby told Spirit's story. The abandoned kitten, the boy who loved him, the months of near-death depression, the slow healing that had saved them both. He spoke about Vietnam, about liberty, about second chances, and the bonds that transcend species. "Tomorrow they want to take him to a zoo," Bobby concluded, his hand pressed against the fence where Spirit leaned into his touch. "They call that a solution. I call it a slow death." The story aired that night on the 10 o'clock news. By morning, the Whitmore phone was ringing constantly with calls of support, offers of help, and something Bobby hadn't dared hope for, politicians feeling the heat of public opinion. But Officer Hayes still had her orders, and 48 hours was 48 hours. The real battle was just beginning. 1 week ago, Bobby Whitmore stood at his kitchen window, watching the early morning mist rise from the pastures like ghosts of all his failures. In 6 hours, Officer Hayes would return with a transport team to remove Spirit from the only real home the Bobcat had ever known. The media attention had bought them time, but not salvation. Bureaucracy ground forward with the inexorable momentum of an advancing army. The phone had been ringing since dawn, with reporters wanting updates, supporters offering prayers, and politicians making empty promises about looking into the matter. But none of it changed the fundamental reality. At 2 p.m., Spirit would be loaded into a government truck and driven away to die slowly in a concrete cage. Mary Beth found Bobby slumped at the kitchen table, his coffee cold and untouched. Dark circles under his eyes told the story of another sleepless night spent in the barn, sitting vigil with a condemned animal who trusted him completely. "Eat something," she said gently, setting a plate of eggs and bacon in front of him. "Can't." Bobby's voice was hoarse from hours of telling Spirit stories, trying to comfort an animal who couldn't understand why his human family seemed so distressed. "Keep thinking about liberty. How she looked at me right before." Mary Beth's hand found his shoulder, offering the kind of wordless support that sustained marriages through decades of storms. "This isn't Vietnam, Bobby. This isn't your fault." "Feels the same." He stared out toward the barn where Spirit waited. "Feels like I'm failing another innocent creature who trusted me to keep them safe." That's when they heard it. A car engine in the driveway, but not the official rumble of a government vehicle. Through the window, Bobby saw a beat-up Honda Civic with Montana plates, driven by someone young enough to still believe the world could be fair. The driver emerged slowly, nervously. A teenager with sandy hair and the kind of careful posture that spoke of someone carrying adult responsibilities too early. Bobby recognized something in the boy's face, the same desperate determination he'd seen in his own mirror 50 years ago. Mary Beth opened the front door before the boy could knock. "Can I help you?" "Ma'am, I'm Tommy Mitchell." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the gravity of what had brought him here. "I think you have my best friend." The words hit Bobby like a physical blow. This was the boy. The one who'd raised Spirit from infancy, who'd loved him enough to risk everything, who'd been forced to give him up by parents too afraid to understand. Tommy had grown in the 4 years since losing Spirit, but his eyes still held the same fierce protectiveness that had made him hide a wild animal for half his childhood. "Tommy!" Bobby rose from the table, suddenly seeing the situation with startling clarity. "You found us." "Took me 3 years to track him down." Tommy's composure cracked slightly, revealing the 12-year-old boy who'd lost his best friend. "I followed him from the wildlife center to the sanctuary to here. I've been saving money for gas and looking for the right time to—" He stopped, overwhelmed by emotion and proximity to the creature he'd never stopped missing. "He's in the barn," Mary Beth said softly. "But son, you should know. They're coming for him today. taking him to the zoo. Tommy's face went white. No, no, they can't. He'll die there. He doesn't understand cages or crowds or... His voice broke completely. He thinks I abandoned him. He thinks nobody loves him anymore. Bobby saw himself in this boy. The desperate need to protect something precious, the helpless rage against systems too big to fight. But he also saw something he'd lost decades ago. The unshakable belief that love could overcome anything. "Come on," Bobby said, heading toward the barn. "Let's see if he remembers you." The walk across the yard felt eternal. Tommy's footsteps were hesitant, fearful of disappointment after years of hope. Spirit had been a kitten when they'd been separated. Would he remember? Would he care? Or had months of trauma erased the bond that had sustained them both? Bobby opened the barn door and stepped aside. Tommy took a tentative step forward, then stopped, staring at the magnificent animal Spirit had become. Gone was the playful kitten he remembered, replaced by 60 pounds of apex predator with amber eyes that held depths of suffering no child should have to witness. "Spirit?" Tommy's voice was barely a whisper. The bobcat's head snapped up from where he'd been dozing in the morning sunlight. For a moment, nothing, just the suspended breath of a universe waiting to see if love could bridge 4 years of separation and trauma. Then, Spirit exploded into motion. He launched himself across the enclosure with a power and grace that reminded everyone present that this was still a wild animal, still capable of bringing down prey twice his size. But instead of aggression, Spirit's every movement radiated pure joy. He crashed against the fence with enough force to rattle the posts, pressing his massive frame against the chain link and calling out with sounds Bobby had never heard before, not the deep purrs of contentment or the chirping calls of greeting, but something primal and desperate and overwhelmingly happy. Tommy was crying before he reached the fence, his hands shaking as he pressed them against the wire mesh. Spirit's huge paws came up to meet his palms, and for a moment the barriers between them seemed to dissolve. "I never stopped looking for you," Tommy sobbed, his forehead pressed against the fence. "I never gave up. I knew you were out there somewhere, and I knew you needed me." Spirit's response was immediate and heartbreaking. He began grooming Tommy's fingers through the fence, the same behavior he'd shown as a kitten when comforting his human brother. The sound of his purring filled the barn like a diesel engine, vibrating through the ground and into Bobby's boots. "Jesus Christ," Bobby whispered, watching a reunion that redefined everything he thought he knew about animal emotion. "Mary Beth, you seeing this?" But Mary Beth was already on her phone calling Daniel Running Bear with an urgency that surprised even her. "Daniel, it's Mary Beth Whitmore. You need to get down here right now. We may have found our solution." For 20 minutes, Tommy and Spirit reconnected through chain link and wire mesh, their conversation conducted in a language older than words. Tommy told Spirit about high school, about getting his driver's license, about the wildlife biology classes he'd been taking since sophomore year. Spirit responded with headbutts and purrs and occasional gentle nips at Tommy's fingers, all the affection of a cat compressed into the powerful frame of a wild predator. Bobby found himself remembering liberty, remembering the bonds that formed between species when survival depended on trust. This was something beyond ownership or training. This was family, pure and simple. When Daniel Running Bear arrived 30 minutes later, he found a scene that would have challenged everything he thought he knew about human-wildlife relationships if he hadn't spent 20 years working with impossible cases. "How long since they've seen each other?" Daniel asked, watching Tommy describe his wildlife education program while Spirit listened with rapt attention. 4 years, Bobby said. "Kid was 12 when they took Spirit away." Daniel pulled out his phone and began making calls with the kind of urgency that suggested possibilities Bobby hadn't dared consider. state wildlife departments, educational permit offices, sanctuary partnerships. Tommy's wildlife certifications, earned through 4 years of guilt-driven dedication, might provide the legal framework they needed. There's a precedent, Daniel explained between calls. Educational programs with certified handlers, particularly those involving rescued animals unsuitable for release. It's complicated, but possible? Mary Beth gripped Bobby's arm with desperate hope. With the right paperwork, the right partnerships, the right demonstration of educational value? Daniel smiled for the first time in days. Yeah, it's possible. The sound of vehicles in the driveway interrupted the planning session. Officer Hayes had arrived early, accompanied by a transport team and tranquilizer equipment. Through the barn windows, Bobby could see them preparing for what they assumed would be a routine wildlife seizure. Tommy's face went pale with determination that reminded Bobby of soldiers preparing for battle. "They're not taking him. Not again. I won't let them break his heart twice." But this time they had something they'd lacked before: hope, documentation, and the beginning of a legal strategy that might just work. The real fight was about to begin, but for the first time in weeks, Bobby felt like they had a chance. Spirit pressed against the fence between Tommy and Bobby, connecting the generations that had found each other through love for one extraordinary animal. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Present day, the Montana autumn sun cast golden rays through the barn windows as Bobby Whitmore adjusted his phone camera, preparing to capture a moment that would defy everything the world thought it knew about the relationship between man and wild beast. 6 months had passed since that terrible Tuesday when Officer Hayes arrived with tranquilizer guns and government paperwork. 6 months since Tommy Mitchell's tearful reunion with his childhood companion had changed everything. The legal victory had come slowly, built on a foundation of community support, media pressure, and the kind of bureaucratic creativity that only emerged when politicians felt the heat of public opinion. Tommy's wildlife education certifications, earned through 4 years of guilt-driven dedication, had provided the framework. Daniel Running Bear's Sanctuary Partnership had supplied the institutional backing, and the Whitmore Ranch had become the first privately operated educational wildlife facility in Montana's history. But the real miracle wasn't legal. It was lying across Bobby's chest at this very moment, purring like a diesel engine, while 60 pounds of apex predator kneaded his flannel shirt with massive paws that could crush bone but chose instead to offer gentle affection. "You getting this, Tommy?" Bobby asked, holding his phone steady while Spirit stretched across him like the world's most dangerous house cat. Tommy, now 17 and impossibly mature for his age, operated the backup camera with the precision of someone who'd spent 4 years preparing for this exact moment. "Got it, Bobby. The whole internet's going to lose their minds when they see this." Mary Beth watched from her kitchen chair, knitting needles clicking in a rhythm that had become the soundtrack to their transformed lives. At 70, she'd discovered that love truly had no expiration date, and that family could arrive in the most unexpected packages. Spirit had brought them Tommy, and Tommy had brought them a sense of purpose that neither Bobby nor Mary Beth had felt in decades. "Tell them about the collar," Mary Beth suggested, pointing to the weathered leather around Spirit's neck, no longer just the faded military webbing from his mother, but now adorned with Bobby's own dog tags alongside Tommy's wildlife certification badge. Bobby's weathered fingers traced the metal tags that caught the afternoon light. "This here's Liberty's legacy," he said to the camera, his voice carrying the weight of 50 years of survivors' guilt finally transformed into something beautiful. "Spirit's great-grandmother saved my life in Vietnam. Now her descendants given me a reason to live again." The transformation in all of them was remarkable. Bobby's nightmares had largely disappeared, replaced by peaceful sleep earned through days of meaningful work. Mary Beth's latest cancer screening had come back clear. Her doctor attributed the improvement to reduced stress and renewed purpose, and Tommy had blossomed from a guilt-ridden teenager into a confident young man with college plans and a clear life mission. But it was Spirit's transformation that truly defied belief. The broken, suicidal animal who'd arrived at the Whitmore Ranch 8 months ago had evolved into something unprecedented, a wild predator who chose to trust, to love, and to serve as a bridge between species. His educational demonstrations at local schools had inspired dozens of children to pursue wildlife careers, and his story had generated enough donations to fund 3 other impossible rescue cases. People ask me why we saved a bobcat that most folks would call dangerous, Bobby continued, his free hand stroking Spirit's head while the big cat's purrs rumbled through both their bodies. I tell them Spirit taught us that the wildest thing in this house wasn't the animal with sharp claws. It was the love that grew between a broken old soldier, a grieving teenager, and a creature that should have been our natural enemy. Tommy moved closer, and Spirit immediately extended one massive paw to touch the boy's face, a gesture of recognition and affection that never failed to bring tears to the adult's eyes. 4 years of separation had been erased by bonds stronger than time or trauma. "The first night I brought him home as a kitten," Tommy said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I promised him I'd never let anyone hurt him. Took me 4 years to keep that promise, but some promises are worth fighting for." The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the barn that had become their sanctuary. Through the open doors, they could see the Montana wilderness stretching toward the horizon, the natural world where Spirit should have lived if circumstances hadn't intervened. But none of them mourned that loss anymore. Spirit had found something rarer than freedom in the wild. He'd found family. Mary Beth set down her knitting and joined them for the final shot, her hand resting on Bobby's shoulder while Tommy knelt beside the camera. 3 generations united by love for one extraordinary animal who taught them that healing was possible, that second chances could transform into miracles, and that family was defined not by DNA, but by the willingness to fight for each other. "One last thing," Bobby said to the camera, his voice thick with emotion as Spirit stretched and yawned, displaying those impressive canines that could end a life, but chose instead to offer gentle kisses to weathered human skin. "My granddaddy used to say, 'The Lord works in mysterious ways.' Took me 70 years to understand what he meant. Sometimes God sends angels with wings. Sometimes he sends them with whiskers and attitude. But love is love, and family is family, no matter what package it comes in." Spirit opened his amber eyes and looked directly into the camera, those wild depths now holding something that wildlife experts insisted was impossible. The deep contentment of a creature who'd found exactly where he belonged. His purr intensified, a sound of such complete happiness that it seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the barn. As evening approached, their daily routine unfolded with the comfortable predictability that had replaced chaos and grief. Tommy would stay for dinner, a nightly tradition since the legal victory. Mary Beth would cook too much food and insist everyone take leftovers home. Bobby would settle into his recliner with Spirit draped across his lap like a 60-pound fur blanket. And they would count their blessings, each one more improbable than the last. The video would be uploaded that evening and go viral within hours, generating millions of views and thousands of comments from people around the world who needed to believe that love could triumph over bureaucracy, that broken things could heal, and that sometimes the most unlikely families were the most perfect ones. But for now, in the golden hour of a Montana autumn day, they simply existed in the peaceful contentment of a promise kept, a debt repaid, and a love that had transcended every boundary the world had tried to impose. From case number 2847 to family member, Bobby murmured, scratching behind Spirit's ears while the big cat's purr filled their small corner of the universe with the sound of pure contentment. Sometimes the longest journeys bring us exactly where we were meant to be. Spirit's response was to nuzzle deeper into Bobby's chest, his wild heart beating in rhythm with the old soldier's damaged but healing one. Outside, the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars just beginning to appear. Inside, 3 humans and 1 extraordinary bobcat had proven that miracles weren't extinct. They just required the courage to love something the world said was impossible to save. As Tommy often said when visitors questioned their unconventional family arrangement, love doesn't make sense on paper, but it doesn't have to. It just has to be real. And in that peaceful barn, surrounded by the family he'd helped create and heal, Spirit purred his agreement with the profound wisdom only animals seem to possess. That home isn't a place you find, but a feeling you create when you choose to stay and fight for the ones who matter most. The video would end with that sound, Spirit's contented purr mixing with Bobby's gentle laughter and Tommy's quiet, "I love you too, boy." It was the sound of healing, of second chances realized, and of wild hearts learning to trust again. It was the sound of family. Sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin when we think the story is ending. Bobby Whitmore was 70 years old, carrying 50 years of Vietnam nightmares and survivor's guilt, when a broken bobcat named Spirit taught him that healing has no expiration date. What started as saving 1 abandoned animal became the salvation of 3 generations, a grieving veteran, his cancer survivor wife, and a teenage boy who'd never stopped believing in the power of love. Spirit's journey from death row to sleeping peacefully on Bobby's chest proves that second chances aren't just for the young, and that sometimes our greatest purpose reveals itself in our later years. Their unconventional family shows us that it's never too late to open our hearts, to fight for what matters, and to discover that the family we choose can be just as powerful as the one we're born into. As Bobby says, the Lord works in mysterious ways. Sometimes He sends angels with wings, sometimes with whiskers. At any age, we can still be someone's miracle, and they can be ours. Love multiplies, it doesn't divide, and the capacity for joy and purpose only grows with time when we have the courage to say yes to unexpected blessings. What unexpected family member has brought the most joy into your later years? Have you ever had a second chance that changed everything? And what advice would you give to others who think it's too late for new beginnings? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how love has surprised you.